Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Best Practices in Planning for Large-Scale Solar. We're so happy to have you join us today. Can we get the next slide, please? My name is David Morley. I'm a research program manager with the American Planning Association in Chicago. I've been working on planning for solar energy related issues for about 15 years now, and I'm so happy to share some high-level thoughts with you here today, and even happier to share the time with a few other folks. Can you get the next slide, please? So a few housekeeping details here. Just to let everyone know, the webinar is going to be recorded and will be available on ICMA's YouTube channel. As a reminder, please place your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat feature, which is probably disabled for you. And we will have some time at the end to do some Q&A. We're going to have some polls throughout the session. We really want to hear from you, and we want to squeeze as much as we can in this next hour. So when the polls come up, treat it like a game show. Respond as fast as you can. For certified planners that are participating today, this activity is eligible for 1 CM credit, and you can claim that in the normal way. And this is the first part of a 3-part series. We have 2 more webinars coming up, one on large-scale solar and community benefits, and one on large-scale solar developments on brownfields and underutilized land. Details forthcoming on those. Next slide, please. So here's a high level of what we're going to try to cover over the next hour here. I'm going to touch briefly on some key planning themes from the Solar at Scale guidebook, and I'm going to do that as a means of sort of level setting for us here today. And then I'm happy to be joined by Nels Johnson and Charlie Nichols. I'll introduce them in turn. Nels is going to share some practical guidance for planners and local officials, and also clue us into some important resources that I think can help us do good planning work. And Charlie's going to share a case study of his experiences in Linn County. And then, as I already teased, we'll have some time at the end for some questions and a little bit more information about forthcoming things. Next slide, please. So we're going to switch to our first poll now. So what best describes you? I think Kelsey's going to bring that poll up. We're trying to get a sense of who's in the room with us here today. Give it 1 or 2 more seconds for folks to respond. Switch to results. Lots of staff folks here, as that's what I would expect. Some consultants, some elected and appointed officials. That's great. Some advocates, some solar industry folks, and some others. Terrific. Move on to the next slide here. So this webinar here is brought to you by Solar at Scale, which is a partnership between the International City-County Management Association and the American Planning Association. And we have financial support from the U.S. Department of Energy. Our primary charge is to help local governments achieve better large-scale solar development outcomes. And we do that through two different programmatic activities: education and training, such as this webinar here today, and then also resources, such as the Solar at Scale guidebook. Next slide, please. So if you have not done so already, I would strongly encourage you to download the Solar at Scale guidebook. You can get it from the link here on the screen. I'm sure that information about this, when you register for this webinar, we have information, and I'm sure we'll find other ways to communicate with you about this guidebook. Next slide, please. And I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes just pulling out some key planning themes from this guidebook. And I'm going to start with an overview of the guidebook itself. Next slide, please. So the guidebook is structured in 8 modules. The first 2 modules are just foundational concepts to sort of help us have a shared conversation about large-scale solar. The next 3 modules are really, I think, the heart of the guidebook. These are widespread opportunities for really any local jurisdiction to take action on large-scale solar. And then the final 3 modules, these are kind of the sort of stretch activities. It's going to be things for local jurisdictions that have already sort of taken some initial steps and already have a pretty good sense of where they want to go, and some other potential opportunities to act for local jurisdictions that have some special circumstances. Next slide, please. So if I had to distill the core planning messages of the Solar at Scale Guidebook down to just a few bullet points, this is what I would come up with, and I'm going to walk through each of these in turn. But I really want to stress, these are the core points. So when you're thinking of large-scale solar, the concept of large is context sensitive. I think it's fairly intuitive to us all that large-scale solar has the potential for benefits and trade-offs. A really important point I want to hit on is that as you're thinking about what your community is going to do, a vision should be guiding your strategies. You should have a sense of the role that large-scale solar development could play in your community. And then the last point, which I'll touch on just very briefly, is that the strategies you choose to implement that vision, they do affect outcomes. Next slide, please. So what do I mean when I say large is context sensitive? Well, the solar industry thinks of projects and facilities primarily in terms of their rated capacity. So they're thinking about how much power is this facility producing. But from a local perspective, the amount of power that's being produced is typically subordinate to the space that a project takes up and where that project is located. So the local impacts for a project definitely tend to be more closely related to the site area than the rated capacity. And then also, what seems large is going to depend on the surrounding land use context. What's large in one place could seem quite small in another. Next slide, please. So while the basic theme of the guidebook is that drawing distinctions between large and small should be a matter for local discussion based on local context, the guidebook does put forward some sort of basic thresholds here that just to have a shared conversation. And to be clear, the guidebook distinguishes between community scale solar and utility scale solar as two different subtypes of large scale solar. So a community scale project is one that theoretically could fit into the existing land use context of a community. And so that'll be different from place to place. And then a utility scale project is something larger than that. And there really isn't typically a realistic use case scenario where the power being generated at that facility is directly going to the local community. Next slide, please. Now, I want to make a side note here. So the phrase community solar is definitely used a lot in some contexts. And in the context of the Solar at Scale Guidebook, we're talking about the physical characteristics of a project when we say community scale and not the business model. So community solar is usually a description of a business model. So these are shared solar projects that allow community members to purchase ownership shares or subscribe to a project. So a lot of community solar projects or shared solar projects wind up being community scale solar projects, but size doesn't really have anything to do with whether something is a shared solar project or not. Next slide, please. So large-scale solar definitely has the potential to have both benefits and trade-offs for any given host community. And the specific benefits and trade-offs are going to depend on siting, project design, and the business model. So given sort of default market conditions, it's fairly unlikely that your typical or average large-scale solar project would provide all of the benefits listed on the left here to a host community. And but there's a corollary. It's also unlikely that any given project would have large trade-offs that match all of those on the right. They're likely to have some, but not all of these trade-offs. Next slide, please. So if you don't remember anything else, I want you to remember that it's important to do a plan that addresses large-scale solar development in a community. I think it is totally normal, totally typical. I've heard the story over and over again of the first time that a community is thinking about large-scale solar, it's when they receive an application for a specific project. But I would suggest that ideally, you want to think about this at a higher level, and you want to think about the relationship of large-scale solar to other community goals, because it's not inherently good or inherently bad, but it does have a relationship to a community's ability to achieve important objectives that it wants to achieve. And furthermore, thinking of it at a high level and putting it in a plan gives local officials and planners a chance to think through the different sort of levers they have to influence the market for local solar development. Next slide, please. So as you're formulating this vision, you want to engage a broad range of stakeholders in your community. Not every community is going to have every group listed here present, but many communities have many of these stakeholder groups. The idea is not simply to go through some sort of technical exercise of what's possible and what are we going to do, but to really engage these stakeholder groups to try to get a better understanding of where they see the opportunities and what their concerns might be. Next slide, please. And in this process, you want to stay focused on the big picture. So you want to ask folks, how do you think large-scale solar development might benefit you, your organization, or the community as a whole? You want to get a sense of what their biggest concerns are about large-scale solar development, and then you want to collaboratively try to think through what are some strategies that could help overcome these concerns. Next slide, please. Now, ideally, at the end of this, you're going to document your vision in the local comprehensive plan. This is the most powerful single policy document that's available to local jurisdictions across the US. It's the only one that's statutorily enabled in all 50 states. And I think that one of the most important things you can do right up front is acknowledge that energy from the sun is a local resource. You could choose to use it or not, but it's there to be used, and it is local. And then I think it's really important to highlight the relationship between large-scale solar development and different community priorities, rather than thinking of large-scale solar development in isolation. And then, of course, you can provide policy objectives and recommendations that ideally will set the stage for you to capture specific benefits and manage specific trade-offs. Next slide, please. And then at the end of that process, there are a range of levers that planners and local officials can pull to try to affect outcomes. And each one of these has tremendous potential. I think we're going to get into some of these in a bit more detail in subsequent presentations here. So for the sake of time, I'm going to leave it at that. Next slide, please. Again, if you haven't done so already, please download the Solar at Scale guidebook. It's a terrific resource. And now we're going to bring up our second poll. So how far along is your jurisdiction in planning for large-scale solar? Folks, another second or two to weigh in on this. We'll bring the results up. Wow, really evenly mixed here. We've got quite a few folks that have established a vision and a clear policy direction. Quite a few that are in that process right now, more that are thinking about it. And then the largest single group, though, a narrow plurality here, is not doing anything yet. All right, close that poll and move on to the next slide here. I'm really thrilled to be joined today by two terrific presenters, Nels Johnson and Charlie Nichols. I'll introduce Nels first and introduce Charlie in a few minutes. So Nels is a senior advisor and co-leads the Nature Conservancy's renewable energy deployment strategy. He works with the Conservancy's teams across North America to integrate smart siting into energy development. The goal of the strategy is to achieve economy-wide net zero emissions by 2050 while minimizing impacts to nature and local communities. Nels has a BA from Reed College and an MS in forest ecology from the Yale University. He lives with his wife in Bozeman, Montana, and I'll turn it over to Nels. Take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, Charlie. And I just want to say that the Solar at Scale guidebook that you were just summarizing and providing kind of a high-level overview of is really a great resource. It's a great starting place. What I'm going to do is just kind of share how we've taken a look at renewable energy, and solar is probably the most significant and growing part of the renewable energy space these days. And share kind of some high-level kind of conclusions about how to go about planning, how to go about policy, how to encourage spatial planning for the accommodation of this huge amount of new infrastructure that is part of the clean energy transition. It's really the biggest wave of infrastructure development in the United States and really worldwide since at least the interstate highway era back in the 1950s and 60s. It may even be bigger in terms of land use and the amount of investment that's being made. So it is going to come to every community, every landscape in the United States if it hasn't already. And so planning for it, being ready for it, and being proactive about it and how it can best fit in communities and in landscapes, we think is really just a really important thing to be focusing on now. We are about 20% of the way into the build out we're going to see between now and 2050. So we've seen a lot, but we're going to see a lot more in the next 25 years or so. So next slide. So you may ask yourself, well, why does the Nature Conservancy care about renewable energy planning? And it really is driven by our two goals of protecting all life on Earth. That's biodiversity. That's kind of the original kind of mission of the Nature Conservancy, what we're best known for. You know, we're one of the largest landowners. We are the largest private landowner in the United States right now. Much of that is driven by our work to conserve important natural habitats. But increasingly, climate change has become a really important challenge to our conservation mission. And so adopting, a climate program that has net zero emissions as our goal over the next several decades, we believe is vital to achieving our mission. And so the renewable energy part of reducing emissions is the biggest piece, right? 75% of what we need to do to reduce and eliminate or at least get to net zero emissions is going to come from renewable energy. All right, so next. So, in 15 minutes, I can't do a lot in terms of very specific guidance on energy planning, and you can find it in these resources, including the planning guide that we just heard described. But I'm going to give you some high-level kind of takeaways from some of our more in-depth work, and then leave you with some resources that you can easily access because there's lots of great information in a variety of places. So when we think about renewable energy development, we like to think of it as being something that needs to be balanced. And we're trying to optimize for outcomes. As David said earlier, there are trade-offs. And if we pursue one, we're going to reduce outcomes for another. And so the way we like to think of this is the 3 C's. We're trying to achieve simultaneously better conservation, better climate, and better community outcomes. So how do we plan for that? How do we design for that? And how do we engage the public in helping to shape that vision so it can be implemented in ways that work for all, if not most, if not all people? Next. So at kind of the top of our list, we have conducted a series of 3 now scenarios where we've modeled how do we get to net zero, first in California, then in the Western United States, and then nationwide, looking at land use and what are ways in which we can get to net zero that avoid most impacts to sensitive natural and working lands. And by working lands, I mean primarily agricultural lands, especially those that have high value and are very productive. And what we found is yes, in spite of the amount of infrastructure that's coming, we can get to net zero. We can avoid most of these impacts, and it doesn't have to cost much more. And in fact, we think the cost is actually probably less than 3 to 6% additional, because there are many soft costs of putting projects in sensitive places that we don't have good data on. So for example, permitting delays, public opposition that slows a project down, increased amounts of assessments and studies that need to be done to satisfy the criteria for getting a permit. Things like that can add to costs, and we're not capturing those. So we think that all in all, doing it right in the first place doesn't have to cost more. Next. So some of the conclusions we come from that work after modeling all this out is, first of all, we need to plan at all levels. You know, we plan for transportation, we plan for housing. We have never spatially planned for energy except on a project by project basis. We need to take a more holistic approach, as David was saying earlier, to looking at the landscapes in which energy is going to be sited. And we're talking about networks here, because any one project isn't going to be effective or fully operational without other components, and they connect with each other, just like a transportation network does, or any kind of network that you can think of. So we need to think in landscape terms, we need to think in network terms. We have to recognize that energy is different in different places, has different challenges, different opportunities, different things may be important for incentives. So for example, in agricultural areas, we may want incentives that reward agrivoltaics, that is combining solar with agriculture in ways that both can be productive, might be an incentive, whereas in an urban area, that's not so important. We think it's really important that projects that have mitigated risks, that is, have done that work to do planning to avoid impacts to the natural environment, to local communities, they have de-risked themselves from a lot of risks that may interfere with their success in the future. Those kinds of projects we think should jump the line in permitting and interconnection requests, things like that. There are thousands of projects out there, and they are not all going to make it to the finish line. We think the ones that have done that work to do good planning and de-risk themselves deserve more of a chance to see the finish line. As David was saying earlier, community engagement is super important here. And equitable benefit sharing is going to be more and more vital as more and more this infrastructure visits more and more of the landscapes and communities around the country. If communities don't feel like they're getting an equitable benefit from that development, they may oppose future projects. And we've seen a lot of resistance in communities across the country because there's a perception that those projects are not adequately benefiting the local community. We think with all this infrastructure that's coming, we need to think about land saving approaches. So agrivoltaics, as I mentioned, is one of those things. But there are other things that we can do to save land, including co-locating solar with wind, for example, not just having them separate. And then finally, transmission is just a huge, huge issue. It can help us be more efficient in the amount of generation we build. And we can't get the clean energy we need to meet our energy needs and get to net zero in a couple of decades without significantly expanding our transmission infrastructure, particularly between regions, so that we can share energy more efficiently across regions and across the United States. Next. Here are some policy areas or themes that we've identified as where local governments and state governments can be making a difference in terms of rewarding what we call, those 3C energy projects that are optimizing between climate, communities, and conservation. I'm not going to get into the details here, but you can see these. We have a report that will be coming out on this in the next couple of months, so you'll be able to read more detail about these kinds of policy pathways. Next. And these are just some characteristics. What David was already saying about the planning guidebook, a lot of this is already here, but these are things that we just have seen in our experiences around the country as being really important. Interagency consultation is really important. It's something that's hard to do. It's something that isn't done enough of. We have too many silos between subject matter, but also between agencies, and there's not enough communication in planning. We need to really foster more interagency consultation. As I mentioned earlier, landscape planning is just essential for the future of energy development. Community input, of course, needs to be robust. There need to be clear opportunities for people, and they need to be equipped with information and tools that can help them participate in a meaningful way. Community benefits, it doesn't have to just be a formal community benefit agreement, but some focus on what kind of benefits does a community want, what kind of benefits are fair given the scale and the size and the revenue generated by a project are all very important. One thing we're working on with large energy buyers is siting standards, so that a lot of energy investments now are being driven by large companies like Amazon, Salesforce. We've worked with them. We've worked with Rivian Motors and others to help them develop procurement policies to guide where they get energy from. And now we're working with the broader industry to see if we can't develop siting standards that start to kind of give everyone kind of a clear signal about what kind of siting is appropriate, and so that we see more movement towards kind of standard ways of doing siting. All right, so next. I just want to leave you with a few thoughts here that will touch on the future of what you're going to be hearing on a future webinar on brownfields and minelands or former industrial lands. There is a huge opportunity, we think, for accommodating a lot of renewable energy on these kinds of sites. EPA estimates that almost all solar could be accommodated on former minelands and brownfields across the country. About 93% of all projected solar in the future. So, it could be an important opportunity. We know there are challenges with it. We've just published a report last year called Mining the Sun, where you can find out more. I'll show you just a little bit on that in a moment. But that's one big opportunity. And, especially local governments often have some jurisdiction or some relationship to brownfields and former minelands, or a state agency does. And so there can be avenues there where states and local governments can really be helping to facilitate focus on developing in these places in a way that's appropriate for the community. And here's just a few factoids about how much of this land is available. We've mapped it nationwide, so we've mapped those opportunities for doing this kind of development across the United States. Right now, there's only about 2.5 gigawatts worth of energy on minelands and brownfields, but we're seeing it grow. It's starting to finally grow. We're helping to get some fairly large projects going, including an 800 megawatt project in Kentucky called the Starfire Project. Next. And then here's another one that may be of interest, especially to local governments, and that's floating solar. There's growing interest on whether water storage facilities, water treatment facilities, irrigation facilities could be used for solar. And there's quite a bit of potential there too. And again, this would be like brownfields and minelands and brownfields, an area where there may be less potential for conflict. And so it may be more compatible with some of those operations that those water bodies are being used for. And in fact, there may even be some benefits for those operations. For example, minimizing evapotranspiration loss because the water is covered by the panels, at least partially. Okay, so next. So I just want to leave you with some key resources, and I believe these slides will be available to you. You can click on each link here. This is the Power of Place reports. There are 3 of them, as I mentioned. There's lots of data available that can be used at a local level if you're interested. Next. We also have something that's even more detailed called Site Renewables Right now covers wind and solar for these 19 states in the central part of the country. We are expanding it nationwide, and we will be including new energy technologies beyond solar and wind. And again, you can see the link there. I mentioned the Mining the Sun report that we published last May. Lots of information there if you're interested. And again, there's a link. And then we have some more detailed information that you can use. It's actually at the project level. So we've developed principles for low impact solar design. So it's actually project design that comes from our experience working primarily in North Carolina, where there's been a lot of solar development in the Piedmont and coastal plain regions. Next, we also have a pollinator-friendly and smart solar planning guide that we've developed as well. That is a project level guide that can be used by developers and planners. And then there are some really great resources that have recently come out from a variety of sources. This one is from Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, and it's all about community engagement, community benefits. It's really a terrific publication. This is something that we all need to master better than we have in the past, and it's really going to be important to the future of renewable energy development. And then last, I want to leave you with these RSTEP programs that are being funded by DOE. They're in these 12 or 13 states across the country. If you're in one of those states, you can contact the RSTEP program in your state with questions, with guidance, with consultation about energy planning and energy development in your community. Is really a great resource. And so again, there's a web link there. And I'll leave it there, David. Thanks.
Thank you, Nels. Terrific information. I think we're going to switch over now to our next poll question. Maybe 2 polls in a row here. So first up, which of the following are the most significant large-scale solar benefits that you or your community have identified? Give folks another couple of seconds to weigh in here. Put the results up. Expanding clean energy resources. Well, interesting. Was the highest number of people weighed in on that one, and then followed by working towards local climate or decarbonization commitments, which is closely related here. Interesting. Productive use for contaminated or underutilized land. All of these had a pretty good showing here. All right, let's move on to the next poll here. So which of the following are the most significant large-scale solar concerns that you or your community have identified? Another couple seconds for folks to weigh in here. Put the results up. Oh, interesting. So the impact on agricultural soils or prime farmland is the top vote getter here. Loss of rural characters behind that. Again, closely related, I think, in a lot of folks' minds. Okay, next slide, please. So next, we're going to hear from Charlie Nichols. And Charlie is the Director of Planning and Development for Linn County, which is one of the most populous and fastest growing areas in the state of Iowa, that is. And outside of work, he enjoys tending to his backyard chickens and working on home renovation projects with his wife and 3 children. Charlie holds an MS in urban planning from the University of Iowa. Take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, David. I'm Charlie Nichols. As David said, I'm with Linn County. I've been here about 6 years, and I've been in the director position for 4 years. I'm going to share a little bit today about Linn County's experiences permitting these large-scale solar sites. So I'm not going to focus on the nuts and bolts of our ordinance today. There are links to that in the presentation at the end. You can go over our code at your own leisure. What I am going to go over is the process of how we got to where we are today. I'm going to discuss a brief history of Linn County utility scale solar projects, what prompted us to look at a renewable energy overlay zoning district. I'll go over some of the projects we've permitted in Linn County. I'll go over using renewable energy committees to use public feedback to update our code after we've approved projects, and then I'll go over some lessons learned. Next slide. So to start off with, this is going way back, in 2013, staff noticed that an Iowa Utilities Board application had been filed for a 2.5 megawatt solar generating facility in Linn County, which at the time we thought was pretty large, or staff here thought was very large, and now seems a little bit quaint. But there was no code on the books for utility scale solar sites. We had consumer scale solar, pretty well down. We have been doing that for a while, but nothing for utility scale solar. And we define utility scale solar as interconnected panels or arrays whose primary purpose is wholesale or retail sale of generated electricity. So in early 2014, we adopted code for our first utility scale solar ordinance, kind of in anticipation of this 2.5 megawatt project. Next slide. This is a historical slide from a 2014 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting where we were talking about our utility scale ordinance. And these are some of the issues we were considering. And actually, these stand up pretty well. A lot of these things listed here are things that are still big parts of our current ordinance. I would say really the only thing we don't think about or address anymore is access to the electrical grid. We kind of leave that up to the developer to figure out. I'll also note that at this time, these projects, utility scale solar projects, were permitted by conditional use permit by the Board of Adjustment. Next slide. So, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, we looked into creating an adopted code that established a overlay zoning district for utility scale solar projects, moving away from the conditional use permit. And what prompted this decision was a visit from a developer from Clenera Energy in about 2018, who was looking to do a 100 megawatt utility scale solar project in Linn County. They were looking into land leases at the time. They didn't have the available land yet, but they were sure they wanted to do a project in Linn County. And so we looked at our ordinance and kind of realized, our ordinance is geared towards a much smaller project. When we're looking at 100 megawatts or 700 acres of land, we didn't feel like our ordinance at the time was really suited to handle that kind of project. Next slide. So we started to think about whether a decision of this magnitude that encompasses this much land area should be made by the appointed Board of Adjustment members or by elected officials. We discussed this with our Board of Supervisors and decided that it would be better to have this run through our Board of Supervisors, the elected officials, rather than the Board of Adjustment. So we changed our utility scale energy permitting process from conditional use to a rezoning, and we created an overlay zoning district. So for those of you who are not zoning practitioners, or even for those of you who might not have heard of an overlay zoning district, an overlay zoning district sits over the base level of zoning. So a property typically has one zoning district. It could be agricultural, residential, natural resources. We created an overlay district that sits on top of that. So we could have a renewable energy overlay agricultural zoning district. And that establishes additional standards that are stricter for specific uses. It also allows uses in the underlying zoning district to still be permitted. And this gave us a lot of flexibility in establishing criteria for utility scale solar projects while still allowing everything permitted in the base zoning district. Next slide. So there are two areas that have been zoned to the renewable energy overlay district so far. One of those areas is the Coggin Solar project by Clenera. This was the company that came forward in 2018 and was interested in a project. This map of the Coggin Solar project shows the fenced-in area and the panel locations. And then there's an inset that shows the actual rezoned area that was rezoned to renewable energy agriculture. Because you can't rezone part of a parcel, you rezone the whole thing. And this is one reason why the overlay district made sense to us, because other uses allowed in the underlying zoning district could still continue. So even if only a small part of the parcel was needed for the actual project, for the panels, everything else on the parcel was still allowable under the underlying zoning district. Next slide. So following the approval of the Clinera project, which was approved in 2020 or early 2021, the next year we had another company come forward, NextEra, and apply for 2 more projects, Duane Arnold Solar phases 1 and 2. It's shown here on this map. Next slide. This is Duane Arnold Solar phase 1. It's about 50 megawatts, 316 acres at the site footprint. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this map, there's a large area of impervious surface or concrete. That is actually the decommissioned Duane Arnold nuclear power plant. And this power plant had a generating capacity of 650 megawatts. And we think this is a large reason why Linn County is seeing multiple utility scale solar projects, because this power plant was decommissioned in 2020, which then left a 650 megawatt gap in the electricity grid that companies are now trying to fill up with things like solar projects. Next slide. And this is Duane Arnold Solar phase 2. They applied for phase 1 and phase 2 at the same time. Phase 2 is about 150 megawatts and 815 acres of project area. It also included a 75 megawatt battery energy storage system. Next slide. So this is an overview or a picture of what a battery energy storage system looks like. I had never seen one of these before the developer applied for it. The batteries themselves look very similar to shipping containers, and the project for Duane Arnold Solar phase 2 was 96 containers. They're about 20 feet by 8 feet each, with about 22 inverters, 4 containers per inverter. Next slide. And here is the site plan for the proposed phase 2 battery energy storage system. It's about 96 containers. This actually hasn't been built yet. I have a photo at the end. Phase 1 and phase 2 are completely built out with the exception of the battery energy storage system. There was some jockeying at the Iowa Utilities Board over rate setting for electricity. And as a result, the battery energy storage system was put on hold, although the developer is now moving forward with it. Next slide. So this is a photo of the completed phase 1 Duane Arnold Solar project. You can see the nuclear power point to the upper left of this photo. But for about 9 months, there were 250 workers a day working on this project out in Linn County, and it's now fully operational, both phases 1 and 2. Next slide. So Nels mentioned that there is often public opposition for these projects, and we definitely saw a lot of public opposition. Almost immediately, before we even got an application for our first project, the public got wind of it and formed kind of grassroots groups. This is a Facebook group that was formed, No Solar in Our Backyard. Signs were made, people showing up to our meetings had t-shirts and hats that all had kind of the matching No Industrial Solar logo. We had to rent a gymnasium because our own meeting space was not big enough to hold all the crowds we were getting. We would have multiple 6-hour plus meetings. And this is even after we implemented a change limiting public comment to 5 minutes per speaker. We were there till midnight a few nights with these public meetings. We were also sued over all 3 of the solar projects we approved, and we had the pleasure of setting legal precedent for utility scale solar projects in Iowa. Next slide. So there were a laundry list of concerns from the general public showing up to these meetings. And most of the people showing up either live near the project or they lived in Linn County and had relatives near the project. And I've kind of grouped the concerns into different buckets. And anything from property values, aesthetics, stormwater runoff, drainage, to farmland conversion, growth, and end-of-life responsibility. Some of these concerns were addressed by our ordinance, but some of them were not. Next slide. So the Duane Arnold Solar phases 1 and 2 projects were approved in 2022. And we felt that we could improve our code. Staff and the board both felt this way. And we also knew that we would be having more utility scale solar projects in the future. Duane Arnold Solar 1 and 2 contributed about 150 megawatts of energy production. The power plant contributed 650 megawatts. So there's still quite a bit of energy generation capacity in our grid. And the developer NextEra has communicated that they are going to be applying for phases 3 and 4. So we wanted to improve our code and kind of take some of the lessons we learned from their first 3 projects. So what we did is we asked the board and were granted a 1-year moratorium on rezoning requests for the overlay district. While that moratorium was in place, staff considered how best to engage members of the public and other stakeholders that had been involved in the meetings. And how we did this was we formed 4 renewable energy committees. We had an application process and interested parties could apply and were sorted into these 4 groups. The makeup of each committee was pretty unique. We had a blend of people who were very vocally supportive of these projects at our public meetings and a blend of people that had concerns at our public meetings. And then each committee also included 1 member of the Planning and Zoning Commission and then a staff member to facilitate the meetings. And each group met at least 4 times over a period of 3 months. Next slide. So these were the 4 different committees. We had a good neighbor practices group that was focusing mainly on mitigating conflicts between utility scale solar uses and residential uses. They were looking at setbacks, screening, sound and noise requirements. We had a group looking at life cycle costs. They were mainly looking at the decommissioning plan. We had a group looking at balancing agricultural resources and solar resources. This is a big thing of our comprehensive plan. We want to conserve our valuable agricultural resources while also improving our renewable energy resources. So we had a group looking at how we could do that. And then we had a group looking at battery energy storage systems. We didn't have any code for battery energy storage systems at the time, so we were kind of starting from the ground and working up on that. So each committee was responsible for creating statements. The committees themselves were not writing code. They would produce a statement saying, we recommend that these setbacks be increased. And then the Board of Supervisors reviewed all of the statements and gave zoning staff direction to either, yes, let's act on the statement, or no, we don't feel like we need to act on this statement. Based on that, staff then took the feedback from the committees and the board, developed new code, and that was approved and adopted in September of 2023. So any new project coming forward will now have to meet this new code. Next slide. So here's a short list of our lessons learned, and I know we're kind of at time right now, and I want to leave time for questions, so I will cover just a couple of these that I think are the most important. The first is application fee. Something we did early on was increase our zoning application fee for this project. It's pretty sizable. I think each of the projects, the zoning application fee was about $50,000. And we used that money to, 1, rent a larger facility. We also had to hire an audio-visual crew to live stream our meetings at this offsite facility. And then we also hired third-party experts. We don't have the expertise on staff to review things like a decommissioning plan, an environmental mitigation plan, and make calls on whether or not that information is accurate. So we use those fees for facility rental, for and evaluating plans for these projects. We also got really specific on how we were balancing agricultural and solar resources, and we now require agricultural impact mitigation plans where developers are, 1, they're mapping where all the drainage tile is so that they don't hit it, but we also have vegetation requirements that are intended to build the health of soil over time so that when projects are decommissioned, that land can go back into production and it can hopefully be a little bit healthier than it was before the project started. We also worked on a scorecard, and I don't have time to go over that, but it's in our additional resources here. So our entire code is online here. We have a website for our utility scale solar projects. All of our public meetings are on YouTube on this webpage. So if you have a free 20 hours or so, you can watch those. The Solar at Scale guidebook has great resources. There's a link to the Court of Appeals ruling on the rezoning of our parcels. And then we have some information on battery energy storage systems. Next slide. So I know we will have some time for Q&A here, but if you have questions that we don't get to today, this is my contact information. feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to talk about this.
Thank you so much, Charlie. So yeah, as we've already teased, now we're going to open it up to some questions from that you've submitted here. The first question is something I'm going to try to take a swing at and let the other presenters weigh in at as well. I'm afraid maybe I miffed this up front. So we had somebody asking, can you define large-scale solar? So my maybe unsatisfying suggestion at the beginning is that defining it should be a context-sensitive exercise. And to say a little bit more about what I mean by that, in practice, most of the projects that are entering the interconnection queue right now are quite large. So they have rated capacities, typically over 150 megawatts, and they are taking up hundreds, if not thousands, of acres. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean it looks the same in every part of the country. So if you're in the Northeast, let's say, a typical large scale project in the Northeast is still quite a bit smaller than that. You know, we might be talking about dozens of acres of site area instead of hundreds or thousands. But as a local jurisdiction, it is important to think through what makes sense as a definitional threshold for you to distinguish between large-scale projects and other types of projects. And sort of from a foundational perspective, almost all of these projects are ground-mounted PV projects that are happening on relatively flat land that is either already been cleared or will be cleared for the project. Okay, I don't know if either Charlie or Nels wanted to weigh in more on that sort of definition of large scale. Charlie had offered how his jurisdiction defines it in terms of who the off-taker for the energy is. But I don't know if either one of you wanted to say another word about that.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. That is the main way we define it. It's energy that is not consumed on site, but then is sold wholesale or on the retail market. We also specify that it is an interconnected set of solar panels or arrays. And even though our projects have been spread out, they are all interconnected with underground cables, so that fits our definition. But there are various ways to define it, but I think most, if not all, definitions of utility scale solar specify that it is producing energy that is for wholesale use and not to be used locally on site.
I will say that's common. The downside of that is where the energy is used can change over time and isn't foundational to the land use impacts of that project. So the amount of space that a project takes up, I would argue, is more important than where the energy goes, unless you have specific policies in place that are speaking to the business model of the project. Then it matters where that energy goes. I have a question here for Nels specifically. Someone was asking if we can see specific opportunities for solar on brownfields or minefields by location. They were wondering if there was some kind of map or information available for that.
Yeah, so if you go to our Mining the Sun site on nature.org, just nature.org, Mining the Sun, or type in Mining the Sun in Google, you can find a map that we've developed that has identified minelands and brownfields that are over a certain size, so they can accommodate projects that are, say, well, we have two classes of projects that we've selected for utility scale, which is 20 megawatts and bigger, and then community or distributed, which is less than 20 megawatts. That's how the industry often defines scale as size, the size. So that's kind of a well-accepted convention within the industry. And you can find brownfields and minelands that, meet those sizes and are within a certain distance of transmission and substations. So they're feasible to develop. You could have a perfect mineland in the middle of nowhere, but if it's not next to transmission, there's no substation for, 100 miles away, no one is going to want to develop a project there. So you have to be, within proximity of transmission infrastructure. And then we screen some other things like is it a key migratory pathway for, large, game in the West, for example? And if it's in the midst of that, then maybe we didn't include it. So we screened some project sites out because of those potential conflicts. So yeah, I'd encourage you to go look. We're going to try and make that more interactive in the next year so that you can zoom in and out and get more information about each individual site. And I'd also direct you to the EPA's Repowering America initiative. They have a whole inventory of projects across the country, details about those projects. You can learn about what people are doing. You can see who's developing the projects. Really a great resource. And they also have information about, where are some of these sites.
Great, thanks, Nelson. Here's another, I think, quick question for Charlie. So does the solar overlay zoning, does it have impacts on taxation, or is the land still taxed as ag if that's the base zoning?
That's a great question. And every state taxes these projects a little bit differently. The zoning does not impact taxation, but the energy generated is taxed, and it's taxed based on what market it's sold in. So we don't actually know as a county how much tax revenue we're going to get from these projects until the end of the year, when we get reports from the Iowa Utilities Board on how much energy was produced, where it was sold, and then they kind of remit that tax revenue to us. We still collect base tax revenue on the agricultural land that is being used during the project.
Great, thanks. This may wind up being our last question here. Almost all of the rural communities I work with have substantial opposition to renewable energy. Can each speaker suggest best practices to engage opponents? Maybe we'll start with Nels.
Well, so I think the first, step is developing, kind of a large spatial area plan that the community members have a chance to weigh in on. The problem with so much development is that a developer comes in, finds a site, leases it without telling anybody, and then applies for a permit. And by then, almost all the steps have been taken that the community might have influence over. And so what's important is to send a signal to developers where you want it and where you don't want it. So they have already been informed by the community's kind of preferences. So that's the most important thing that can be done. And the second is, what are the benefits that the community wants in exchange for hosting that energy project? Maybe they just want another fire truck. Maybe they want a playground. Maybe they want an area restored that's next to the project site, so there can be a park or something else. But there are benefits that people want to get in exchange for hosting these projects. And we need to be creative in finding ways to accommodate those desires, I guess.
Charlie?
That's a tough one. It helps if you have a good comprehensive plan that lays out a vision for how you want the community to develop. When you have hundreds of people showing up who have concerns, you're not going to be able to address all of them, but there inevitably will be some concerns that kind of align with goals in the comprehensive plan. And the elected officials or staff, in our case, were able to add conditions to address some of the concerns. Not all of them or even most of them, but they were able to address some of the public concerns for these projects. It didn't mean that everyone was happy, but it did mean that people were able to see their elected officials kind of reacting to the tone of the meetings. Another thing that was really helpful from public engagement side is as we move from project to project, the developers realize the importance of having kind of more perspectives in the room. So the applicants, the developers, were proactive in making sure that people who supported renewable energy showed up to the meeting. So we had an equal representation of people that were supportive and people that had concerns. So there wasn't a tide of negativity. It was a fairly balanced meeting room when we got to the third project.
Thank you both. I think for the sake of time, we'll let that be. There's a couple of other things we want to draw your attention to here. If you're not aware of the Energy Ready programs, SolSmart, Distributed Wind Smart, and Charging Smart, please do take a look at those and see if they might be right for your community. We have some upcoming webinars that I sort of teased. We will get information out to you about those if you would like to be informed. And then finally, we have some resources we want to tease one last time here. So you can go to the Solar at Scale homepage to get connected to everything. You can go right to the guidebook. We had a, I think, 9-part webinar series a couple years ago with lots of good information there. And if you have any questions at all, you can reach out to Kelsey. And we are right at time. Thank you so much. Here's our standard acknowledgement that this was funded work by the Department of Energy. We are so glad you all were able to join us this afternoon. Take care and hope you join us next time.